This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric with you. Today we're going to jump into a new podcast and we're going to focus on new concepts in critical care and emergency medicine. So this podcast should be about 10 minutes. I always say that and I tend to run my mouth a little longer than I should. So hopefully I will keep it under 10 minutes and we're just going to look at 3 new concepts in critical care medicine. We're going to try to do this every month and then we'll take those new concepts and we'll actually form a good educational podcast based on that stuff. So this is stuff that I've just come across in the last, I'd say, month that I want to bring up. And, you know, the big focus on why I started FlightBridgeED was to get critical care concepts, new research, new theories down to the rural areas, these small hospitals, these EMS agencies that have a hard time finding this information. So that was the whole point of me initially starting FlightBridgeED. So I think it's important that we continue with that mission, that we look at these concepts, we try to disseminate it and dissect these things and get them out. So the first thing I want to bring up, if you've ever heard of a new concept, it's called REBOA. REBOA is called resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta. So that was a big word. So resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta. Well, what is that? Well, this is a concept that has been in vascular surgery for quite a while, years, and they use this technique to basically occlude off a major artery during surgery so they can fix that artery. And then it dawned on somebody to maybe apply this to a traumatic injury with massive hemorrhage, whether it's blunt or penetrating trauma, specifically pelvic fractures, things that we see our patients absolutely exsanguinating from. So this concept, this procedure is something that in the United States, University of Baltimore, Maryland, shock trauma, Dr. Brenner, she's leading the way in the United States and applying this to trauma. And so essentially, really quickly, what they do is they divide the torso up into 3 zones. Zone 1 is basically at the level of the heart. Zone 2 is going to be from the diaphragm down to right above the renal arteries, and zone 3 is approximately at those renal arteries down into the pelvis area. So what they do is they place a sheath, a cordis, and this balloon through the femoral artery, just like we would see during a cath. They're going to place this, they're going to slide it up into place, and they're going to inflate that balloon. Based on what zone it is, it can stay inflated for, if it's zone 1 up near the heart, I think approximately an hour, hour and a half. If it's zone 2 or 3, they've been doing 4 to 5 hours that these patients will have this occluded off artery. And essentially what they're doing is they're attempting to stop the bleeding from the point of where the injury is and down distally. And so this is a pretty cool thing if you think about it. This is a big deal as far as I'm concerned. I mean, this is going to change the way we see pre-hospital medicine. And why do I say pre-hospital medicine? Well, there's an actual HIMSS program in the United Kingdom that staff physicians, and they actually just performed a few months back the first REBOA in the field in a traumatic injury, MBC. I think it was an open book pelvic fracture, and they performed a REBOA in the field. So that's pretty amazing. So just be looking for a podcast on that. I believe MCRIT, Dr. Weingart, he did a podcast on that and looked at that, and there's other critical care MD level podcasts that have touched on this. I just wanted to bring this to you guys in the HIMSS pre-hospital industry, let you know about this, and we will do a podcast and focus more on the educational aspects of that. The second thing I want to talk about is no more cervical collars. What does that mean? Holy cow. There's a website out of Scandinavian area. It's called ScanCrit, and ScanCrit is an emergency medical critical care anesthesia blog made up of a few different MDs over in Europe. And they looked at this literature and they basically made a recommendation that we don't place cervical collars on every single patient. Now you can imagine the backlash, you can imagine how people are going to take this. I'm sure you sitting there right now, if you haven't heard of this, you're probably dropping your jaw as I did. And this is their quote, and I will put this link in the show notes. We suggest against spinal motion restriction, defined as the reduction of or limitation of cervical spine movement by routine application of a cervical collar or bilateral sandbags, in comparison to no cervical spine restriction in adults and children with blunt suspected traumatic cervical spine injury. There's a weak recommendation, very low quality of evidence. Values and preference statement. Because of the proven adverse effects in studies with injured patients and evidence concerning a decrease in head movement only comes from studies with cadavers or healthy volunteers, benefits do not outweigh harm, and routine application of cervical collars is not recommended. So when I heard about this, I actually came across this on Twitter. I was discussing a few concepts with a doctor out of Australia that does the Farm podcast. And we were all having a debate, and this popped up and came up, and so we started discussing this. Now, obviously in the industry, we've seen a paradigm change where there are EMS agencies, EMS systems that are actually clearing C-spine in the field. I've used that term, and I had an anesthesiologist on Twitter actually correct me and say he would rather not use the word clearing, which I guess I can understand. It's all on how you say things, because there's really no way we can clear without an x-ray. But there are EMS systems that have a protocol for looking at patients from an objective standpoint, doing a good assessment, critically thinking, and making a determination if they need to be C-spine or not, which I completely agree with. I don't think we should just arbitrarily C-spine every single person that we come across. Obviously, this is a big thing when you look at medical direction and the liability that falls on them, and I'm sure this is going to be looked at 1,000 different ways. And we will discuss this further in, again, another podcast, and I'll keep you posted. Again, I will put a link to the PDF, to the article in the show notes on the website, on the blog, and so you can look at that. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm going to do a focused, probably 3-part series on this topic, but get rid of dopamine in the pre-hospital environment. Levofed is the primary pressor, and it should be the primary pressor. Why do we have all these EMS agencies that are still thinking 20 years ago? We need to have progressive minded people that are open to new concepts, new research, new trials, and there are an abundance of trials and research that have shown that dopamine is a bad medication. Now, it's not bad in every single circumstance, but for the purpose of a first-line pressor on an ambulance for basically any patient, I think it's absolutely horrible. Here's why. Here's my thing. The first thing, and it's been proven, and I will again put these links in the show notes, and we will start next week on a first part series on looking at dopamine, looking at Levofed, and then we're going to continue through. We'll look at neosynephrine, we'll look at vasopressin, we'll look at milurone and things like that. So the first thing, we in critical care in medicine, we've been taught to look at perfusion from the standpoint of urine output, and we're taught that we want 30 to 50 cc's per hour, that's optimal. If you have burn patients, obviously you want at least 100 mils per hour, but the urine output is our gauge for perfusion. Well, dopamine, even at 5 mics per kilo, increases significantly the urine output of our patients. We have to remember that our kidneys receive 20% of our cardiac output, and that once our MAP pressure drops below 65, maybe even 60, our kidneys recognize that, and it shunts off and it stops allowing perfusion to those kidneys because it knows that the rest of our body needs that cardiac output. So it says, all right, I'm going to shut off. I don't need to produce urine at this point. And that's what our kidneys do. So if you have a patient that is hypotensive, if their MAP is below 65, and then we start giving dopamine like that, and we're trying to gauge their urine output to see how well they're actually perfusing, and now we give a medication that is going to optimize urine output, you can see how that's going to give you a very false sense of how perfused your patient really is, how sick your patient really is. Studies have shown that the low dose, 2 mics per kilo per minute, is not something that we want to do to increase the perfusion to the kidneys. And that we also have learned that once you exceed 10 mics per kilo, you start having very detrimental effects. You have decreased cardiac output, you have decreased diastolic clearing and filling, because that heart rate, because there's so much inotropic effect of dopamine, that you start increasing myocardial O2 demand, and that's going against everything we're trying to do. I can't tell you how many times I've been on a patient where I've arrived at an ICU, small ICU, and these patients have been absolutely hemodynamically unstable. They're on dopamine at 20 mics per minute, and they're hypotensive and they're tachycardic at 150. I mean, I can't tell you that it's been countless times. And every single time, all you do is you titrate that dopamine off, add a little Levophed, and 9 times out of 10, the patient completely turns around. Once you start lowering that heart rate and you allow for diastolic clearing and filling, then you have a optimal heart. Your heart is working better. So we're going to look at this concept. We're going to look at dopamine in more depth. We're going to look at Levophed in more depth. The few things that dopamine is good for, pediatric patients, where they need heart rate. They need heart rate because that's what gives them that stroke volume and that cardiac output. So that's a good medication to start with in the pediatric population, maybe in sepsis. Obviously, you can use epi and other pressors. And then a bradycardic situation in an adult associated with hypotension. If somebody needs rate control, they need some rate help, then we can add dopamine, and I think it's a great medication in that context. But just to arbitrarily throw dopamine on an ambulance and say that's your primary pressor and not look at the whole big picture, I think is reckless. And we need to be looking now at the current science, and Levophed is the medication. The whole old sayings of leave a fed, leave them dead is absolutely false. That's a misguided misconception, and Levophed is here to stay, and most intensivists in the world, that's their primary pressor in all situations is Levophed. Remember, Levophed in low dose has great preload effects. It also has afterload effects. So you can give a very low dose of Levophed, you're going to get great preload optimization. You don't have to give as much fluid, because we know fluid can be a bad thing. Instead of giving 10 liters of fluid in 24 hours, start giving 2 liters of fluid starting out. Give low dose Levophed. It has very, very low cardiac effects, so you're not going to have that huge increase in heart rate. And then the aspects of that heart rate being low, you're going to have better diastolic filling and clearing, and that's going to lead to better cardiac output. So we're going to look at all these things. We're looking at pressors in a way that is easy to understand, and this is a concept, again, that Scott Weingart had come up with. I thought it was excellent. All credit goes to him, but he classifies pressors in 3 different ways. A pure pressor, so that's neosynephrine, that's Levophed. An inopressor, right? An inotropic pressor, that's going to be dopamine. And then an inodilator. Inodilator is going to be like dobutamine and milurone. So we're going to look at all those. We're going to classify all those in those categories and dive into this topic and other pressors here shortly. That's all I have for this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your comments. Come on here and leave your comments on the blog. I'll write a little blog on this. Look for the different links in the show notes and share this with a friend, and we will talk to you soon.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.